Dr. Klaus Grunert, quien esta mañana dictará la clase magistral, sin aislamiento en la cocina, cómo la pandemia del COVID-19 ha afectado la conducta en relación a la comida en Europa.
Thank you. This is a great honor for me, and I really am very proud that I'm here today and get this distinction here by the University of La Frontera. It really means a lot to me, and I really would like to thank the university and its representatives for bestowing this honor on me. And not least, I would like to thank Professor Schnettler, who has been my main contact here during these years. She was the one who invited me coming here for the first time, and we've had a very fruitful collaboration ever since. I've been here a couple of times. We did a lot of good work, and it was a great pleasure for me working with her and with her colleagues and her team, and I hope this will continue for many years to come. I look forward to coming back here many times and to interact not only with Berta but also with the other colleagues here and the faculty. The piece of research that I would like to show you here today has to do with something we all know, namely the COVID-19 pandemic. It is about how the COVID pandemic affects food-related behaviors. That means the way we eat and what we eat and why we eat. And maybe that's not the most important outcome of the COVID pandemic that we're thinking about, because there are a lot of other much more serious consequences. But this also is interesting, and since dealing with food-related behaviors, it's my area. That's what I've been working with for the past 30 years. That is was Berta is working with as well. So I've been doing some research together with some other people about how the pandemic has affected food-related behaviors. And why is that interesting? It's interesting for two reasons, because if the COVID-19 pandemic has had an effect on the way we eat, it's interesting for the food industry, of course, because they have to adapt to changes in customer behavior. But as I will show you, it's also interesting from a policy perspective, because in policy, food policy, we have for many years been trying to get people to eat more healthily. More recently, we have tried to get people to make sustainable choices, and it has been a little bit uphill. And the pandemic actually may change that, and I'll try to explain you why that is happening. Because, as we all know, the pandemic has changed our life in many ways. We had to work from home, we could not go out eating in restaurants, some people lost their income, some people got very ill, obviously, so it has had a lot of impact on our daily life. And one of the reasons why it has been difficult in getting people to eat more healthily in food policy has been that a lot of food-related behaviors are habitual. Because if we do something many times every day, the decisions on what to eat, where to eat, how to eat is not something we think about a lot. We do it almost automatically based on the habits that we have developed over time. And there is research on habits, and it says habits work in stable environments. Because having a habit means you react more or less automatically to something that happens in your environment. This fact that food-related behaviors are based on habits makes it very difficult to change them. But when the environment changes, when the environment suddenly is not stable anymore, it also becomes easier to change habits. And the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the environment in which we live. We had to work differently, we had to eat differently, we had to shop differently. A lot of things suddenly needed to change. In such a situation, when the environment changes dramatically, it means some of our old habits may break down and we can form new ones. And that gives an opportunity also for breaking down habits and creating new habits in the area of food. Because many people actually want to eat more healthily, but they have not been able to do that because their habits were not like that. People find it difficult to change their habits. But when suddenly we are in a situation where we need to change our habits because the environment changes, it may actually become easier for people to align their behavior with their goals. And that is what actually may happen here, may have happened at least for some people during the pandemic here. So I'm showing you two pieces of research that have investigated how food-related behaviors have changed or have not changed during the pandemic. They are both based on survey studies. They are both based on questionnaires asking people. And that gives some limitations because it's what people say, not what they do. But still, it gives some, as I will show you, some interesting results. And we're trying to look at changes. And you can look at changes in two ways. You can compare before with during or after. Or you can ask people, do you think you have changed? And if yes, how? And we've been doing both of that here in these two studies. So they used somewhat different methodologies, but they arrive largely at the same result. And that is why I think it's, we can have some confidence in these results if we have two different studies arriving at similar conclusions. So the first study, where I will present you results only from data from the country where I live, Denmark. It's part of a bigger study, and I want to acknowledge a colleague from Belgium at the University of Antwerp, Charlotte Bakker, who started this one here. But this here is data that was collected in Denmark from a study called the Corona Cooking Survey. And in that study, and Berta, by the way, it's a Chilean part of that study here. In this study here, a lot of things were measured about food-related behaviors, both before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And the one I'm looking at here are the red ones. I'm looking mostly at people's attitudes to shopping for food and people's attitudes to cooking, and whether they have changed because of the pandemic. I also look at how this is related to what we call negative emotional response to the pandemic. People getting stressed, people getting worried because of the pandemic, because of their health, because of their income, because of other things. And then we looked at a number of other things, whether people's demographics and food literacy, which I will not show you here. And what we are doing in this study here, I will not give you the technical details, but what we are doing is we categorize people according to their attitudes to shopping for food and to cooking into different groups. And then we see whether people have changed the group in which they were from before to during the pandemic. The statistics is called a hidden Markov model, but I will skip the technical details here. So this is what we're looking at. We have the Corona lockdown. We look at how it leads to changes in attitudes to shopping for food and cooking. We also looked at how that translates to behaviors. I will not show you that. And then we will look at how this effect depends on the distress caused of the pandemic. And then we look at whether which people are most distressed because of the pandemic. On the bottom here, this is what we measured with regard to attitudes to shopping and cooking. We have negative and positive. The negative is shopping is time-consuming, shopping is frustrating, shopping is stressful. The same for cooking. Cooking is time-consuming, cooking is frustrating, cooking is stressful. Then we have the positive. Shopping and cooking are a type of relaxation, a way to play out creativity is enjoyable. We categorize people according to their answers to this. we get 4 groups. We have the blue group, sort of middle of the road, medium-level attitudes to everything. We have the yellow group, they hate shopping and cooking. They score high on the negative and low on the positive. We have the gray, they are positive to shopping and cooking. They score low on the negative and high on the positive. And finally, we have the orange here. They also are positive to shopping, and they are very positive to cooking. They really love cooking. So we have these 4 groups here. And down here, we have the percentage of people that are in these 4 groups before and during the pandemic. And here it looks like not much has changed. But actually, we can look at how many people, or we can look at the likelihood that people have been moving between the groups. And that is what we have here. Here we have again the 4 groups, middle of the road, love cooking, like shopping and cooking, don't like shopping and cooking, the same over here. These are the probabilities of going from one to the other, from before to during the pandemic. The red ones are the diagonals. That means these are the probabilities of staying where you are. No change. As you can see here, this is for the whole sample. These are very high. So most people don't change. Most people stay where they are. The major exception are people here, people who like shopping and cooking. Some of them change. Some of them become more negative, some become more positive. But becoming more positive is more likely than becoming more negative. Now, we were interested in whether the likelihood of change depends on how much emotional distress is caused by the pandemic. We have measured emotional distress. Then we have divided people into 3 groups, depending on whether the level of distress was high, medium, or low. And then we do the same thing. So here we have the same numbers for people with no distress, some distress, and a lot of distress. And we can see a clear pattern. The more distress you have, the higher is the likelihood that you change. Because here, the numbers in the lower one, the numbers in the diagonals are much lower, and the likelihood of changing is much higher. Again, it's highest here in those that already like shopping and cooking. Many of them now really love cooking. They move to the one where you really love cooking. There's a smaller share that goes the opposite way. They become a little bit more negative. We have also, among those that don't like shopping and cooking, you have a 16% probability of moving to the next higher state, where people become, well, it's okay, shopping and cooking. So there's a clear relationship between the amount of emotional distress due to the pandemic and the likelihood of changing your attitude to shopping and cooking. So who are the people who are more and who are less stressed by the pandemic? There's some pretty clear distinctions here. Those people that have a lot of distress, they're more likely to be female. They're more likely to have a higher education. They're more likely to be young. Young people that have all the future still ahead of them have invested a lot in their education, were most stressed by the pandemic. Also, not surprisingly, if you lost some of your income due to the pandemic, you were more stressed. So the major result from this first study was here that a smaller share of respondents did change their attitude towards shopping for food and cooking. It could go both ways, become more negative or more positive, but it was more likely to become more positive than more negative. And the likelihood of change is related to the extent of emotional distress because of the pandemic. That was the first study. I said I had 2 studies, so now we come to the second study. That was a bigger study where we collected data in 10 different European countries. You can see them here. And Denmark was not one of them, so it's a good supplement to the first study. This looks kind of complicated, but the really important part is the blue one here. That is the meal provisioning chain. No, you shop, you choose some products, you prepare meals, you eat, you do something with the waste. This is the one where we look at changes. So we were asking people with regard to all of this here, have you changed? Have you been doing this more or less or about the same as compared to before the pandemic? We look at how that affects people's consumption, people's well-being, and here we have a range of factors that can have an impact on whether people change. I will not go through all of those, but here we have, again, the emotional distress, and it's measured in the same way as in the first study. Again, also here we group people according to their change. So we do something which is called multi-level latent class cluster analysis. We group people according to their patterns of change. And since we have a study here with 10 countries, we also group the countries, because the countries differ in how much they are affected by the pandemic, in how the government reacted to it, and of course, in their food culture. And just to show you how the results look like, we were asking people a lot of questions. These are examples. For example, dining together as a family during the pandemic. Have you done that more than before, less than before, or about the same? And we usually get that people, if they change, the change can go in both directions. Like here, quite a lot of people said they do that more than before, but there were also a few people who said they do that less than before. And we get that with most of the things. Some people change, some don't. Those who change can change in either direction. So what we need to do is we need to look at the patterns in these changes, which can go in either direction. And we get 5 groups. And this here doesn't show you really a lot. So you jump that one over here and go right to what I think is a more clear presentation. We are interested in whether people have changed their behavior. 60% don't change. So it's the same like in the first study. The majority does not change because that's a resilient group. If 60% change, it means the other 40% do change. Among those who change, the 40%, the large majority, almost all of the 40% here, the green, report that they enjoy food more than before. That is actually one of the major results. The enjoyment with food for most of the people, wherever there's a change, has been going up. That manifests itself in different ways. They have more enjoyment in the kitchen, they're more creative, they have more meals with the family, generally enjoy food and eating more than before. Only 5% goes the other way. And this is a special group. They had loss of income, they have a low education, generally people who have been fighting most with the pandemic. Among those who enjoyed food more during the pandemic, we have some subgroups. We have one group here, they enjoyed food more and they became more mindful about their food choices. Reading the labels, being health conscious, looking at the buy date, buying more local foods, thinking more about sustainability, all these issues. A smaller group here was the other way. They also enjoyed food more, but they were doing that mostly by indulgence. buying more snacks, more sweets, having more enjoyment with some maybe not so healthy foods. And then we had a small group here who was sort of doing both of that. But the two major things here are, if people change, then almost all of those who change enjoy food more. Among those who enjoy food more, you have two major subgroups. The slightly larger one becomes more mindful. The other, slightly smaller one, becomes more indulgent with their food choices. This is the same thing I just explained to you, so we can jump that one over. We also got two groups of countries. Because I said we also look at differences between countries. We get two groups. We get a Northeast European group consisting of Finland, France, Germany, Sweden, and the UK. And we get a Southeastern group consisting of Spain, Poland, Italy, Greece, and Romania. And you can see they differ. Actually, they differ a lot. Because the Northeastern group, which is the one here, most people don't change. 70% don't change. Here, it's only 50% that don't change. So there's a huge difference in the extent to which people change in these two groups. This is a map of Europe. Here you can see it again. The blue ones change less, the yellow ones change more. Why is that? Part is because of food culture. For example, down here, people eat out much more than up here. So if restaurants close, it's a much more severe constraint for people's food habits than it is in Northern Europe. But it has also to do with the way the pandemic developed. This here is from a very interesting database from Oxford University, where there was a group of people who have recorded how the government reacts to the COVID pandemic. And we have two indices here. This is how strict the measures were, how much lockdown, how much constraints and mobility, and so on. This one here is how helpful the government was in avoiding economic problems. So we can see that in those where we had less changes, there were less restrictions in terms of lockdown and mobility and so on. And there was more help for those that were affected by the corona pandemic. So the way in which the government handled the pandemic crisis, it seems also had an impact on the way it reacted to the pandemic, obviously, which also had an impact even here in this food area. People who had a financial loss changed more than people who didn't. Here we have again the emotional stress. People with a low level of emotional stress, low anxiety, most of them didn't change. People with a lot of anxiety, half of them did change. It's the same result as in the first study. If you're very much stressed by the pandemic, you're much likely to change. And if you change, for most people, the change is actually positive towards more enjoyment with food. So the enjoyment with food is like a coping strategy to deal with the stress that you have. I jumped that one over. Finally, we had a measure here that my colleague Bertha knows well, namely people's satisfaction with their food-related life. It's the green one here, and these are the different groups. Those people who change become more happy with their life as regards food. That's not huge effects, but it's pretty clear. So if you change, people change, most of them change in a way so that they become actually more happy with the way they cook and eat. So we find also in the second study, the largest group doesn't change, but 40% do change. If they do change, most of them change in a way so that they enjoy food more. That can go two directions. It can be more indulgence, more snacks, more sweets, more enjoyment, but maybe less health, or the opposite, more mindful, more health, more conscious choices. And the second group is actually a bit higher than the first group. And again, it is related to the emotional distress that people feel because of the pandemic, and it's related to the way in which where they live, the pandemic has been handled. So both of these studies arrive at similar conclusions. The majority of people doesn't change a lot, but those that change in a direction where they enjoy food more. And a sizable part of these changes in a direction of what we could call more mindful eating. And that is interesting because these trends towards healthier eating, sustainable choices, local food products, they're not new. They have been going on already before the pandemic. They were just slow. So we could think that the pandemic actually has speeded up some trends that were ongoing already before the pandemic started. And that is important both for the food industry and for food policy. The food industry needs to live up to these new demands of people with regard to the type of food product that they will buy. But public policy has been talking about what they call the green transition in food in Europe now for the past years, where there is a policy that we want to make more sustainable choices, more healthy choices, more local food, all that. That is the green transition. And it seems that the pandemic actually may have helped in bringing that transition about if public policy is clever enough to grab that opportunity and provide the right instruments that will help people making these healthy and sustainable choices. And that's what I wanted to present for you today. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
Agradecemos al doctor Klaus Grunert por esta importante clase magistral. Antes de finalizar esta solemne ceremonia, les invitamos por favor a ponerse de pie y entonar el himno de la Universidad de la Frontera. Agradecemos su presencia en esta importante ceremonia de la vida académica universitaria. Tengan todos ustedes muy buenas tardes.